Hello.
Okay. Okay, great. So we've heard a little bit about the 2019 vintage from some producers in the Comtal, but not a huge amount. So basically, the idea here is just to get a feeling for what it was like um, at Gobelsburg specifically, and what your view of the vintage was. And Peter, we'd also love your kind of more general comments, if you have them, as we're as we're talking. You bring great perspective, obviously. So, um, even comparing to what some other growers have said, and thinking about in that context would be super helpful. So, 2019 vintage at Gobelsburg. Um, Michael, do you want to start and just talk a little bit about the weather from kind of this period on through into harvest?
Yeah. I what I did in order to make it a little bit more easy to understand actually the specifics of the vintage, I made um, I made a graph. Let me see that I can share with you. Basically, comparison to vintage 2018, and so what you see here is precipitation and average temperatures of vintage 18 and 19. And what you see in vintage 19 is that we had a very dry winter time. You see there's very low precipitation here until April. It was basically nothing in April. And only in the beginning of May, it's starting, we got over the month of May, we got about more than 100 liters, which gave us enough water then for the upcoming month and for the starting vegetation period. Important for us, and which is also one of the aspects, is that due to the dry winter time, bud break and the and the start of the season is quite late. So bud break is at the end of April. Why is that important? We are working here on the edge of the vine growing areas, and so at the end of the growing areas, and so the danger of spring frost is quite high in this area. So if we have a delay in the vegetation series, is always in favor for us, because then the danger of late spring frost is diminished. Now, what you see is that then in June, July, there is not very much rainfall, but there is at least some. So the vineyards have never been really facing any severe dry stress situation. Quite important, especially for white wines, because for white wines we are not favoring very much dry stress. Which is rising the levels of phenolic components in the grapes. And then in the beginning of September, we get about 70 liters, which is in the first week of September, so just before the beginning of harvest. But after that, there's basically more or less only sunshine until the end of October. So there's after the first week of September, there's only 10 millimeters then in September for the next 3 weeks, and over the period of October, I think there was 1 or 2 days where we get a little bit of rain. So with 26 millimeters is more or less nothing, and I think a big part of that is also really at the end of October. So from that point of view, it's just a really perfect year. Now, what is really really interesting in my eyes in comparison to vintage 2018, and I'm going to show you the graph in that respect to the 18 vintage. As you can see that when you're looking to the average temperatures of the month, then you can see that the average temperatures are rising over the summer season. So from April on, June, July, the hottest month is August, and then the temperatures are going down again. If you're looking to that in 2019, you see that the hottest month is June, and from June on, the temperatures are going down. See, so that is this is something that is very much into the favor of the freshness and the acidity levels in 2019, and this is also reflected when we're looking to analyzes the acidity levels are really. I mean, it's not like Germany, but for our levels, it's quite high acidity levels for the Rieslings, already around 8 grams. So this is also another aspect, that is quite significant in the personality of the vintage. When we're looking to harvest time, we've been starting in the second week of September with the first grapes for sparkling. And the main harvest is starting in Gobelsburg always with the red wines. We started with the red wines then at the last week of September. And then everything was going quite fast because, I mean, grapes were quite mature. And there was nothing to wait, and big advantage, there was no selection needed. The grapes were really perfectly sane, so there was no selection needed. We didn't need to select on the sorting belt and so on, because more or less everything could be used. So it's in our history, I think it's the harvest with the least selection work that we ever did, or at least as much as I can recall. And so I would say, in my eyes, it's a close to perfect vintage for us. If I could wish to have circumstances for a vintage, then it would be a bit like how it was in 2019. Yeah. So this is well, for the numbers, you see there's a total precipitation in 2019 was 416 liters. So this is rather at the low end of what we normally have. Whereas in 18 we had 550 liters of rain in total over the year. Yeah, and then I have a few pictures from harvest time at the end of October. This is what I also can show you. This was on the 25th of October. I made a round through the vineyards, and we've been harvesting until the 29th of October. So this was about 4 days before we ended the harvest. It's a bit dizzy, but this is Johannes, his hut at the slope of Heiligenstein.
Beautiful. So really, for the month of after the first week of September, you really had very little rainfall, and you had very even temperatures for a long ripening period and sunny weather.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so in comparison to another vintage, 2000, what other vintage in recent history could you kind of compare 2019 to?
It's a good question. I mean, you know, as you know, I mean, in the past 25 years, no vintage was like any other. The nearest that I could remember maybe was maybe Peter. What do you think? 1999?
Yeah, probably 99 or 97 maybe, but since 97 was not as hot
Yeah.
and not as, quite as dry, so 99 probably.
Yeah, I would say rather 99. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so during fermentation, so you said you were the acidity levels for Riesling were obviously very high, and we heard from a couple of other growers that Gruner Veltliner people were also surprised by the kind of level of acidity for Gruner Veltliner. Was that something that you also expected?
Yeah, it counts for basically all for both grape varieties, no matter if it's Riesling or Gruner Veltliner. For even for the the vineyards that were harvested at the end of October, we are still looking to close to 6 grams of acidity. So no, I mean the structure is really good. I mean the wines are really firm. I think you tasted now the Kamptal, didn't you?
Yes.
And yeah, the wines they are lively, they are fresh, they are clean, and I mean there was no botrytis or whatsoever. Yeah, no, I mean I'm personally I'm really happy with the vintage.
Mhm. I opened both the Riesling and the Gruner Veltliner on the same day, and they're fantastic, both fantastic wines. But I tasted them over the next 3 days, and even last night had kind of the end of both bottles over dinner, and they had improved. You know, they hadn't lost any of their kind of character, and they were very open from the beginning, from the second that we opened them. Are you finding the wines that are still uh, in tank and in cask, are you finding the development different than other vintages in terms of how the wines are tasting right now? Is it a vintage? I guess my question is this a vintage that you think will be likely a vintage which will be developing early and you know, easy drinking, pretty, what we sometimes call like a restaurant vintage? Or is this a vintage where the structure is really going to demand some time for people to wait to drink? I know it's very early to make this kind of.
I mean, it's very early actually, you know, to make serious comments on that. However, um, I mean, in my eyes, it is. I think vintages like this, they are already to an early stage approachable, I would say. However, the development is not as severe as in other vintages. Like, for example, for me, 2015, for example. I mean, it was a very welcomed vintage, for example, and I always called him the everybody's darling vintage. It was a vintage that we did not have to explain, you know, because everyone by themselves believed it's a great vintage. And honestly, I was rather happy that I did not had to talk too much about it, because I was not really sure, actually, you know, if 2015 is the really longest lasting vintage. I mean, it's something that maybe we cannot judge right now, because I mean, it's at the moment the vintage is going through its puberty, and we will see how 15 will develop over time. But I think that uh, I think that 19 will be recalled one of the yeah, three remembered vintages of this decade. And I mean, for me, on one side, especially from the personality, I mean, I know that Peter is. I'm not sure what Peter's opinion is on that. But 2014 is one of my really favorite vintages in the last decade. But it's a vintage that it depends really on the producer. I think it's a producer vintage, and some producers were really able to cope with the situation, and some were not. So there's a big difference between wineries in 2014. And for me, it's a vintage like 2004 that really, made a big. Until now, the 2004s are just fantastic, and I believe that 14 will go a little bit in the same direction. But 2019, of course, and then we will see who will be, yeah, and then probably, yeah, I'm not really sure actually about the third one, but I mean 13 was a fantastic vintage for us, but there might be also like 17. So let's see.
That's exciting. Was there anything about the vintage that it sounds like it was rather homogeneous. Was there any particular vineyard which you felt surprised you in the way that it reacted in this vintage? In some vintages with low precipitation, we often hear growers talk about vineyards which have a high proportion of old vines faring better, for example.
No, I mean the thing is that I cannot even say that that the vintage was in favor to any of the vineyards. From our perspective, I think the bad thing about the vintage is that it was not very difficult, to make some decent wines in 19. So I think in 19 we will see, a quite wide range of really good wines, and this is one of the big differences to 14. 14 was really a producer's vintage, where it really depended, on the knowledge and also on the stomach of the producers to make the right decisions. Whereas 19, it was basically for everyone, I would not say easy, but if you cannot make a decent wine in 19, then you better change your job, something like this. But Peter has, the thing is that I do not have a great overview now on the wines of 19, because as we're all in quarantine, I have not been tasting really a lot of wines from my friends and colleagues, but Peter has more overview actually on that situation. I don't know, Peter, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I agree with almost everything you said, I must say. I mean, we still need to discuss about the vintage 2014, but that's a different topic. I'll go for 13 and 17. I would be with you there. No, I think it's a really interesting vintage, and you saw in the chart that Michael showed in the charts that the interesting thing was, I mean, with the precipitation, even though 19 was lower than 18, that you had this winter that had actually almost no rain whatsoever, or snow whatsoever, and that's where actually 19 lost out on the rain. And the vintage was within Austria very heterogeneous in terms of precipitation in certain months. So in the summer, when most of Austria was totally dried out, it was actually the case that the northeastern part, where Lower Austria and northern Burgenland is, they had a little less to normal, yeah, but not really worrying levels of worryingly low levels of precipitation. So that was quite interesting. And in the fall, when it kind of turned drier in the wine regions, the rest of Austria got huge downpours, and so it was very interesting. It was totally different. And I'm not talking about Styria, because Styria never really has a problem with rain. I mean, they have, in normal years, they have 650 milliliters or something like that. So they had a little less in 19, but it was fine with them. So I think that is a really important point. And also, I mean, in comparison to 18, and I think the comparison is very difficult to 18 for 19 wine. I mean, from the wines and also from the whole structure and also the weather in the summer. It was, I mean, 18 was really, really dry, and it was hotter at night. In my estimation, I would say 19 was also one of those vintages that was not as hot at nighttime. So the temperature difference from day to night was larger than, for example, in 18 or also in 15, for that matter. And I think that really helped. And the rain, you know, even if it sometimes was, you know, a little dry, then there, you know, some showed up at some point and kind of saved the thing. So I think that in character, texturally and structurally, 19 is actually a super interesting vintage. I think it'll be a little different Burgenland, or most parts of Burgenland, to Lower Austria, because Lower Austria had really, as Michael says, a really good rain distribution for the most part. I mean, for the most regions, it was really, yeah, considering it was such a hot year. And, you know, I mean, June was the hottest we've ever had in, I don't know, how many years is it? 250 of records. It's been the hottest June we've ever had. But it's also been one of the coldest and wettest Mays we've ever had. So that was, and as Michi indicated, that caused, you know, a later development of the vines. And then for flowering, it was just perfect weather. I mean, there was no problems there, and it was later, and as everything was later than 2018. So I think the wines, I mean, in Burgenland, what we saw was that you had the harvest, the yields were quite a bit lower than in Lower Austria, because they had more dryness and they had more sun, and kind of they just got the berries were smaller and let's say less juice. So Burgenland is down in I mean, Lower Austria is down in comparison to 2018, but 2018 was in general, you know, a high, very good vintage quantity wise. 19 was more or less normal, but in Burgenland 19 was lower than normal. So yeah, they're probably going to be, the red wines are probably going to be pretty concentrated. And I must admit, I've only tasted a few red wines, not too many, but they're like, I think in general, the vintage is very vibrant and very, really what I call energetic. It's really, and as Michi indicated, also the acidity for nearly everything is really, really good. So you get this really these perky, up on the one hand upfront, but also wines. I think they'll show at least quite a good development, and possibly a very good development. I'm not worried about these wines. I think they're going to go quite a long time, and they're really refreshing. And I think the fruit and also the varietal characters are well developed, but they are not overdone as in some hot years. And are not plummy, of course, not plummy, but they're not overdone. They're rather, in some cases, even a little at present, at least a little holding back, but in an elegant way. So I think this is going to be a really good vintage. Yeah, I'm excited.
That makes me excited. Uh,
Ah,
yeah. Uh, I had a question though. When we were talking about harvest dates at Gobelsburg, I was remembering kind of sitting in the exactly where Michael is now, or close to, and talking about the 18 vintage and hearing very um, different theories from different growers on when was the right time to harvest in 2018. We had some growers who were harvesting extremely early, and some who were waiting and saying, you know, this is no problem. This is the development of the vintage, and we're happy to harvest a bit later. And it seemed like there was even 3 to 4 weeks in the differences between when somebody might start harvest. It sounds like 19 is more kind of similar across wineries because of the way that the vintage was. But are you hearing anything? Were you hearing anything from other growers about beginning harvest much earlier? Because I feel like we've seen that kind of both in Germany and Austria, people starting harvest a lot earlier because of the weather. But it sounds like 19 was more normal, even if it was warm in the beginning of the summer in terms of harvest period.
yeah, certainly.
But I think we've been discussing this also last year. That, I mean, you know, I mean, Peter knows as much as I do that that the world of wine is driven by a series of trends, and currently we are seeing it. You know, we had in the early 2000s and we had a big trend, and everyone was, you know, trying to compete with each other in being the last to harvest. And I sense that currently it's just the other way around. You know, everyone is trying to harvest even earlier than everybody else. And it's, you know, I think every decade has you know, some trends where people are trying out the limits and going either in one or the other direction. And currently people, you know, are trying, because, you know, the term of freshness is something that is so so popular currently. And it seems that people want to you know, to preserve, you know, the freshness in the wines by harvesting early. I'm I'm personally, you know, I've always been trying not to be extreme to one or the other side. I was never the latest to harvest, and I'm not trying to be the first one. I think that studying the history of wine, our ancestors had, you know, some really good advices in trying to find the perfect moment for the harvest, and this is something that you can read in books of the 18th, 19th century, you know, to look after that question, and this is basically, you know, what we are still are following. And I'm trying not to be too much influenced, you know, by some colleagues who are already claiming, okay, now they have already finished, and I have not really even started. So I think that we have a certain idea at Gobelsburg about what we want to achieve, and this is what we stick to. And I think that one of the advantages, you know, being responsible for that estate is that we do not have to be on the edge of each trend. And you know, I think that Gobelsburg belongs to the classics, And in that sense, I think we have a duty, to be true to that, and not, not to go for every single small trend, that is appearing on the wine market. So basically, I mean, I would say it belonged to the rather early years, because for us, an early year is that we are harvesting to the beginning of November, and middle years is that we are harvesting to the mid of November, and a late year in Gobelsburg is that we harvest to the end of November. So like 14, for example, we've been harvesting to the end of November. Or 10, so these vintages really need quite a long time until we get really the maturity that we want, and so we need to take the time. So in that perspective, it was an early year for us. Harvesting until the end of October is quite early for us. But it was a very compressed harvest. So I mean, we started at the end of September, looking to the harvesting days that we used for this vintage, belonged really to the lowest ones that we ever had. I think it was only, I mean, counting for the main harvest, it was only a little bit more than 35 days. Whereas in other vintages, like in 14, we've been using close to 60 days. So this is also, one of the aspects of that vintage.
That's really interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison to 14, or using that as another side of the spectrum is very interesting. And I know that it's a controversial vintage for some, and it was a difficult vintage in a lot of ways, and as you alluded to earlier, kind of a winemaker's vintage. So you had to really take the right decisions. And some of the things that you've said about 19 remind me of what people said about 2015, that it was a vintage where you had to kind of, really be wearing a blindfold not to be able to make good wine in 2015. Do you see that as kind of the closest vintage in terms of character, or is it really a departure in one specific aspect, like the level of acidity, for example?
Well, I don't know. Peter might be, but I'm not sure. But 15, 15 was 15 is a vintage, that was really beautiful in its youth, and I'm not completely sure about the ageability of the vintage. So 15, was a like a very beautiful flowering flower, and fast flowering flower, that is gone then, in a very short period of time. What is Pfingstrose in English? I already knew.
Oh my God.
It's a little bit like this, I think
the Pentecost rose.
yeah, Pentecost rose. Yes. You know that. So it's Pentecost rose is a you don't know? No.
I think it's a different name, actually.
Pentecostal rose.
Let me quickly check. Maybe I can find it.
Pentecostal. Sorry for this screaming children in the background.
It's peony. Peony.
A peony. Yeah. Okay, I see. Yeah. I see what you mean. So a peony is a very beautiful flower. It's very ornate, and it blossoms, and then very quickly turns brown and is no more. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
And that's a little bit 15 for me. Would you agree, Peter, on that?
I think I think you actually have to put it into context with the whole decade of where we had just a number of hot vintages. And I think I totally agree. I mean, 15 was everybody's darling. I think still, I mean, if you take 11 or 11 really aged quickly to my feeling. And I think 12 and 15 are closer together. And I would probably say that 17 and 19 are closer than 15 and 19 to my mind. I mean, if you were to make a comparison, that would be my feeling. Because 13 again was different, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but the substance of 13 is different. But
Yeah.
and also it's yeah, I think you're right. I mean, 12 and 15 is quite, you know, is quite comparable, I would say. And yeah, and then we will see what 16. I mean, 16 is probably also one of the is also might be one of the vintages that might go a little bit in that direction as well.
Yeah, but it was more heterogeneous. 16.
Yeah.
There were some really wonderful wines, great wines, and then there was some that were not as nice.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. Mike was just messaging me about the kind of bud break in and when bud break actually was. So just to kind of make a comparison, in 2018, you had a cooler start to the summer. Did you have in the spring? Did you have an earlier bud break in 2018 than 19? It sounds like 19 was much later.
Yeah, the bud break in 19 was later, about, I would say, 7 to 10 days, and so there was basically no problem anymore than for the start of the vegetation season. There was no problem then with the temperatures. I think there was one day, then I think in the beginning of May or mid-May, where we had +1 or +2 degrees, so where it, you know, became a little bit close. But that was then basically it's, you know, 18. 18. We had I think it was close. It was, there was one more or less dangerous situation where we had about 0 degrees already in the beginning of May. But it was really at the sharp end, so nothing really happened, and with the result that that we had a really big crop in 1918. One thing there's one aspect that I also have to mention, which is interesting in 19. There is a specific period after the flowering of the grapes that is defining the size of the berries. So it depends on how much water you have available in the vineyards. And if you have in this period, if you have a little bit of dry stress situation, then the berries stay smaller. And this is also one of the key factors that is defining also the size of the harvest. And in 19, during this period, it was quite dry. And this was another reason why the bunches, you know, were quite loose, and there was no problem with botrytis infections and so on. So berries in general were rather small, which is also then an aspect in the relation between, you know, the content of the grapes and the skins.
So generally smaller berries, looser clusters, which so botrytis was not, that was the main reason that botrytis wasn't such an issue, is because not just the weather, but also the actual structure of the fruit.
Yeah, yeah. So this is also an aspect that needs to be mentioned.
Excellent. That's very interesting. Well, it is making me very excited for 19. When will you you bottle the village wines, Michael?
We started we did the bottling for the village wines last week. Yeah, last week. Last week the Langenlois and Zöbing were bottled, and also Steinsitz is now already bottled. Because normally the release time for these wines is beginning of May. So this is why normally in April sometime we're doing the bottling for these wines.
Anyone else have any questions?
I do.
Abby has a question.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm on like I keep hitting unmute in the wrong part. You were talking about the people kind of harvesting early because they were looking for, you know, more acidity, more freshness, that sort of thing. In a vintage like 2019, is there any worry for these people about like lacking in any sort of like phenolic ripeness or anything like that? Do you think that people will see that, or is it a vintage that like even if you harvested very early, the wines are totally fine?
I think that I think, you know, this question of decision of picking date depends in many cases on the imagination, on what's going to happen or what you want to achieve in your wines. I think that currently people are not so much worried about phenolics because due to the whole natural and orange wine developments, people are used to much higher levels of phenolics in wines. So people somehow got used to, you know, to phenolics also in white wines, and to some extent they're also looking for it. So that means that the question of phenolic and phenolic maturity is not in the forefront of your decision making. So what seems to be, you know, more the question is about acidity, and this is the reason probably in 18 that people were worried so much about harvesting early, because they were fearing that the acidity levels are dropping down, you know, to the really low end. But for me, it's not only about, you know, about one aspect. I always, you know, take into account all aspects. So it's not only the acidity, it's also the aromatical developments, it's the development of tannins. For me, it's always the whole story that I have to take into account, you know, when it comes to decision making. And this is why I'm tending, you know, rather to look to the whole story than just to one aspect. And yeah, but obviously, you know, when it comes to trends, you know, there's always, you know, one aspect that is so much in the forefront of everything else that it seems to be more important than everything else. Yeah. Good.
That was very helpful and really interesting. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us. if we have any follow-up questions, we'll send you an email. And if you have any other comments or things that you think of that we sort of missed in this discussion that might be relevant, you know, it's always a pleasure to hear from any of you about your feelings on the vintage and sort of how things are developing. I think that's a really interesting question. I think that sometimes we get here, when we're thinking about vintages, we get one specific thing stuck in our mind, and we kind of make overgeneralizations about these things. And I think we probably have done that with 2015 a little bit. And I think that, you know, whatever the vintage was like when it was being tasted by, you know, merchants, importers, and also by the press, is sort of the way that the public thinks about the vintage. And so it's always interesting to hear about perspective now with some years later, what those vintages are like, and the comparison to a peony is now stuck in my mind. But probably not something I'll share too much. I don't want people thinking that this is a vintage that is past its prime already. I haven't yet had that experience, but I'd be very interested to check back on those 2015s now after this conversation, for sure.
I have a question for our staff meeting, for the Zoom meeting on May 6th.
Mm-hmm.
How many will be attending?
So we have opened it up to distributors and to retailers, to our West Coast staff, our Ohio staff, our Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana staff, as well as our East Coast staff. So generally it will be about under 100 people in total. When producers have offered to send samples for people to taste along, generally we are just sending those about between 3 and 5 cases, depending on how many people are participating. We're sending those only to our East Coast staff, which is about, you know, last time I think it was just over 35, 36, something like this. So we're not sending them to everybody I mean, logistically it's not possible because we've just landed new vintages here on the East Coast. And so to get the wines to California, and I've talked to the staff in California, they understand this and also think that so far we've only had two meetings, 2 presentations. And I think even if you don't have the wine, obviously it's still very worthwhile. And as I wrote in my little email, the kind of interaction between the staff and being able to ask questions and talk to the winemaker or you know, the winery directly is really, I think is really helpful and maintains some connection between the two.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Now that would have been my second question, if the people are having the wines or not. So some of them do have the wines or will have the wines, some won't.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So
and some of the
now when we do the tasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the distributors have the wines and may have the previous vintage, for example. So, you know, while some people have one specific wine, and that certainly can be talked about, it's also really good to talk, you know, when we had Andreas Hutful from Von Winning, and he talked about the Grand Cru sites, even though we were tasting a basic wine, just to kind of give people are familiar with Heiligenstein and Geisberg and Renner and Lamb. And so talking with them about that, most of them haven't had the opportunity to be at Gobelsburg and to be, you know, in this kind of scenario where if they have a question, they can ask. And I know that there are a number of people who have interesting perspectives and questions, specifically about, you know, the Erste Lage and eventual Grand Cru classification and what that's going to mean. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion.
Would you send them the information if they have the Erste Lagen booklet and the Erste Lagen maps? They should, it would be great if they have it with them at the tasting, because of course we'll focus also on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say also, if you're talking about, you know, these aspects, I think in this context, it was really helpful to have this graph of the 18 and 19 vintage. So if you want to use the kind of share screen function also to show the pyramid, for example, and the classification, you can do that via Zoom also, and that works well. For the first one that we did with Johannes Selbach, we actually had a couple of people on staff saying, you know, we were showing some pictures of vineyards, which I thought was helpful, but they said, hey, can you take the pictures down? We'd actually really just like to see the winemaker and hear and listen to him talk about the wine. So
and then showing slides at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the discussion is more focused on kind of education and the classification system, when we're talking about that, it's very helpful to have a visual guide, just like with this vintage discussion, having the chart, so you can really see what these things look like is helpful for sure.
And you would be the host.
Yeah.
And would you organize also the chat questions? So if people are having questions, that you collect them and post the questions in between or at the end of Michael's presentation, so that we can follow up the questions as well.
Absolutely. During the presentation, if people have questions there, they can chat them into me if they don't want to ask in front of the whole group of 100 plus people. But there are a number, you know, we also use the if you click on the bottom of your Zoom screen for participants, there's also the raise hand function. So we take like 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to give ourselves some time, and people raise their hands and say, hey, you know, I had this question, etc.
How much time will we be having?
So far it's been between 30 and 45 minutes about that. That's kind of the time. So it doesn't have to get super intricate in terms of the you know, the presentation. You know, it can be I mean, if you want to talk about the classification,
might take longer.
Yeah, it doesn't have to get super technical. I think giving people an idea of what this is and visually showing it to them will be helpful. But I also know that there are a lot of people who are going to be interested to ask specific questions, and sometimes this leads to a really interesting dialogue and discussion.
But the level of knowledge should be average. I mean, not all average, but all the same. So
no,
okay.
No, I would say that we have people on staff who've been with us for 20 plus years and who have been tasting the wine since the very first vintage and know exactly where Lam is and what the soil is and know the winery very well. Some of them have been there and tasted there, and some of them are relatively new and don't know about Austrian wine as much as they probably should. So you have a pretty big range. You have people who are truly experts, and you have people who are a little bit more novice, but they're all wine professionals. So if you're talking about different kinds of fermentation, you know, if you're talking about the differences between the Schloss Kellerei wines and the Village and Erste Lage wines, the Rieden wines, for example, they can understand when you're talking about technical differences between these wines because of their background as a wine professional.
Yeah, but this is important to know about the level of knowledge, that there is a wider range. Yeah. Okay. And do you use Zoom Pro so that after 40 minutes the session could be extended or not?
Yes.
Because the normal Zoom only allows 40 minutes.
No. We have an expanded, unlimited time limit, and I think we have up to 250 people who can join. So it's more people the better in our perspective.
Looking forward to that.
Us too. And this was very helpful, really. So thank you. And
it's Peter, a good tool to at least see each other, stay in contact, stay in touch, and then of course get updated about the wines and the vintage. And at least we can't see each other only through this media now.
It won't last forever.
Yeah. There will be an end. There will be a back to normal life, even if it takes longer than we think, probably.
And then we would like, for sure.
Gabe, I had on Saturday we had a project. You know that on the first weekend in May we are always doing the Tour de Vin. which is basically an open cellar door for all members of the Österreichische Traditionsweingüter. So which means that you can tour around the area and visit each winery where the new vintage is presented and so on. So this year it's not going to happen, so we decided to make a virtual tour de vin. So the setup was that we invited people to join for a tasting, and participants got 3 wines before the meeting, and then basically we as wine makers and wineries were explaining about the estate and about explaining the 3 wines and so on. Is this something that you have been doing as well?
We've been talking about it. We have our first virtual tasting with consumers and retailers on May 2nd. We had our first one as a company Saturday, with a Barolo producer, and I have a conversation later with one of our sales managers who set that up to kind of see how it went. It's certainly a something that I think would be very interesting for consumers, like the people who are coming to the cellar door for the Tour de Vin. And if it's something that you're interested in, we'd love to do that. It takes some, I think part of the, issue right now for us is that, we're a team of 3 people, and it's strange because we have half as many, or less than half as many accounts, but the demand for content and for these kinds of, discussions and meetings has gone way up. So we're trying to balance what we're doing and making sure that, everything is done correctly and done well. But if this is something that you're interested in, absolutely. We know that there are a number of retail shops that would love to do this. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, if this is something that is starting to be done, also in your market, and it seems that this kind of setup is starting now more and more, also organized by retailers or by trade companies.
Yeah, the only issue for us, kind of in thinking about how we do this, is that we don't want to feel like we're favoring one particular place, one particular retailer. So what we've decided to do, at least for the first one, is to open this up to multiple retailers. So they basically sign up, and then they get a link, and there's for the first one we're doing just featuring 1 wine, so to make it a little bit more simple. But certainly we can, expand that to several wines. And unfortunately, as Barbara alluded to, we really don't know how long this is going to last. And I imagine that this kind of virtual meeting, virtual tasting is going to continue even after restaurants start to open up and these kinds of things. So, we would love to have you be involved and to work out exactly, what that tasting would look like. I mean, from my perspective, as the classification, the appellation system, talking about this, it would be great to have a very basic wine, a village wine, and a single vineyard wine to kind of show people what that progression looks like. Long answer to a very simple question, sorry.
But I think we have to face the fact that it might take longer than we expect, and that we have to think of these kind of tools. And I think it's a good tool, or the easiest tool for the moment to use and get people also taste our wines without us being at their place. Since I can't do market visits now at the moment, this would be a chance to do market visits with your clients. That's a good tool in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. And we have, it's not just people in New York and California. We have, David has people in Texas who are interested in doing this. So yeah, it's absolutely.
Just think about it, and it's an offer from our side. And since it's easy to set up, we just need to have the wines at your client's place, and then we can do a virtual tasting tour.
Great. No, we will take you up on that for sure. No question.
Okay, good. I think that it's Monday morning, and you probably have a lot of things to do. So not to artificially, to prolong the whole thing. Thank you very much for the meeting. And if you feel that there are any questions left regarding the vintage, then just let us know. Yeah, then and a good start for the week. Yeah.
Thank you.
And
stay safe and healthy.
Yeah, good luck for you all.
Thank you. We're trying.
Yeah. With your president.
Bye.
Let's not talk about that. Oh my God.
No.
Liberate Michigan. Yeah. Ay.
Throw a civil war on top of a pandemic. It's
Yeah,
cool.
exactly.
I love
It's not boring. That's one thing.
Exactly.
We may be at home, but we have a lot of things to think about.
Be creative.
Well, thank you again, and we'll certainly be in touch regarding more questions and the upcoming tasting and what that will look like, and more things for the future.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Here.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you on May 6th.
Yes. Bye bye.